Hey guys, welcome back to Meta Trends with Mark and Mike. Mike is once again politicking, so it's just me today with Dondi Dix. So thank you for joining us, Dondi. What I'm going to do is ask you a little bit about your background, and then you kind of fill it in for the audience, and then what we'll do is get rolling with the conversation. So Dondi, tell us about your background. What got you to where you are now?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I actually grew up in the Kansas City area, lived in this area my whole life, even though I've worked all over. My background really started with several families, both in my primary family as well as my extended family, all being entrepreneurs and all having various small businesses. So growing up around the Thanksgiving table and Sunday dinners and all of that, everything was about business and about everyone working together and trying to make that work. When I went to college, my original path, I thought I was going to be a clinical psychologist, but turns here and there actually brought me back to decide to major in business instead. Upon graduation, I joined the military because I did ROTC in college over at the University of Kansas. And, I treasure my time in the military. They cross trained me in HR and finance. So after my military service was up, I went into big business for a while. Went into business consulting, had several corporate roles, and it was interesting because my whole family were entrepreneurs, but I was the only oddball that went corporate. And so I learned a lot along the way. Started out with big business consulting, did a lot of mergers and acquisitions work, which I dearly love. And then rose through the corporate ladder for a while with both operations roles and talent and organization design and process improvement type roles. And then after that, long about COVID, when things were changing, I did some soul searching and I decided that I think I was getting back to both to my family roots as well as what I know about my own personality. And I decided, I've been doing a lot of great things and hopefully adding a lot of value to a lot of other businesses. And I think it's time for me to go out on my own and have my own now, much like I watched most of my family do. So I bought a business in 2020. And the last 3.5 years, I've been focusing on first learning that, transforming that, and now have merged it with another similar company, which was wonderful experience. And I hope to do a lot more of that. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, I tell you, it's very well diverse. So so let me ask you a couple of things here. Our audience is entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs. So the from the entrepreneur side, I could see people coming out of the military and thinking, what do they want to do with the rest of their lives? Some even struggle with purpose too. Like they had a purpose in the military, but then they don't. I think that's some of the rougher things that happen, especially for combat veterans when they come out. So what was your experience in the military like? And like, how do you think that prepared you for this journey that you've been on?
I think that there's a lot of things that military service does that you really can't get anywhere else. Just an absolute sense of accountability and leadership and skills that translate in ways that people do not fully understand. I don't think, even when they're going through it. So, in my experience, if someone has a military background, they've always got some really great both leadership and operational chops that they can always bring to just about any business. Which is great, and I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, because when I switched into small business, I have a treasured network of other veteran business owners. And so to have that as a touchstone as we all talk, to each other about what those opportunities have been like is something that has been really great, for me to have. And I do think that a lot of military people are suited and they, when you're transitioning, it's very, very difficult. And I have just enough of an HR background in me to know that looking for a job is hard. Knowing yourself enough to know what you're going to be doing next is very, very hard. But I do think, in particular, the veteran community shouldn't discount the idea of going out and doing something more entrepreneurial after their service, as long as they're supported in order to do so.
All right, so picture I'm presenting in Phoenix to West Point chair and Vistage, and there was 6 West Pointers that were in the audience. And there's an exercise that we do at the end of a Vistage meeting where we're, especially after a presenter, that what we do is we walk around and say, I like to say it's like we actually have a personal responsibility as listeners to glean something from the time we just invested. So what is the one thing that you gleaned, right? What did you get out of this? And we're going around, around, around. And one of the West Pointers goes, well, look, I'm an infantry officer. And he said, so I didn't understand any of this. So a lot of self-deprecating humor like happening. I guess that's natural in the military. But I got a soft spot for veterans. It's like it's something that I feel grateful at what they've done. For that spending the time in the military. So okay, but it doesn't surprise me when you say, okay, I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, and then you got into some of the things you got into, except for the M&A stuff, because typically psychology is one side of the brain, finance is a different side of the brain. But I've seen so many people who are in like organizational psychology. It was like a slight pivot off of clinical or what have you. And it helps a ton when you're dealing with people to understand people as best you possibly can. And psychology is a great, like, what would you call it? A major to have in business, but it doesn't seem like when people are going through it, they don't really see the connection between the two. But it's one of the best things you could possibly do is to understand what makes people tick.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I didn't fully appreciate um, being able to marry that and all the ways that it's helped me and all the twists and turns, and obviously psychology and understanding the human condition, understanding why we do what we do, as well as a very data driven approach to everything. That's still a personal passion of mine, and it absolutely has translated and has never, absolutely never failed me. And I will say, when you said that it doesn't really jive with the M&A, well, in some sense it does. Maybe not at the deal table. But as soon as you start throwing things over the wall and you're merging cultures and you're trying to understand the human condition, because a lot of that value is not going to be unlocked or maintained if you leave the people behind.
Now,
So now you're
you're 100% correct with that. There's actually a certification course out of an organization called Pritchard out of Dallas. It's not cheap, but what it does is it helps you to increase the likelihood of the success of the deal because I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of all deals are deemed failures because they're not integrated properly. And what that really means is a cultural thing. So even though I'm a certified mergers and acquisitions advisor, that's more of an accounting style deal. Like, so if you're strong in math, you can pursue that at DePaul University or Pepperdine or what have you. The one that I recommend for people, because I don't have it, and that's the certification in mergers and integration, because it significantly increases the likelihood of the deal succeeding. Because this is something I've seen in all deals, the sales force, the people, whenever there's a transition like that, whether it's the party that acquires and doesn't treat the people the same way as the previous leadership, or the situation is that the people just want to move on, a good portion of the employees leave, and that's ultimately what you're buying. You're not buying a company, you're buying the employee base. So it's like, how do we look at employees not as costs, but as investments? You see what I'm saying?
absolutely. Well, that, I mean, that definitely resonates with me, and a lot of exactly what you just said and the importance of that. I learned that the hard way, just coming through things, tripping over things, figuring that out, and also having just some really good mentors that they just sort of natively knew that. But I am really looking forward to socializing that course, more in the future, because it's so great to hear that there's a resource like that now that is like, sort of risen to meet that challenge. So that's great.
So then tell me the experience about acquiring a company. Because there's a few things that I think that we could really talk about that I'd like to get your opinion on. Partially because it's a diverse opinion. Like your lived experience is very different than my own, right? And frankly, finance guys, we tend to be very disconnected from the people. Like in theater, they talk about how you are as an actor or you are as a storyteller, and it's one of three categories. Hard head groin is what they say. And whenever I'm dealing with theater people, like we had Michael Alasso on recently. I don't know if you ever seen him present, but he's the king of presenters. The rest of us are just players in the court, right? If they would allow him to, he would have won Speaker of the Year for Vistage 8 times.
Mm.
So now no one else has even won it twice. But he's an actor, and I think the last movie he was in was Pink Panther 2. But he said to me from word go, just meeting me in a second, he said, "Mark, you're all head and all groin. You have no heart." So it's like, and I guess it's the finance guy in me. It's like I don't have a lot of empathy. I don't really care about people's feelings, and like I find feelings and people's perceptions of the world irritating because they tend to be wrong. So it's like, and then I like to go, well, you're wrong about this and you're wrong about that, and I piss people off all the time. So it's almost like I'm borderline Asperger's or something. So it's like, but your situation is different. You're a woman going into the military, which I would imagine you were the minority of the minority in that situation,
Certainly.
right? And people were very dismissive of your opinion about things, and figuring like, who's this person walking in? I think you even had a story about that, if I remember correctly.
I did. What I will say about that, and I think every generation is going to continue to have this challenge, and it is an absolute reality that when you're a minority in any group, there's going to be some opportunities, for people maybe to show their unkind side. What I will say first, though, is that 98% of the time, um, all of my uh, fellow soldiers that I served with were all spectacular human beings, and it's not an issue. It only becomes an issue that 2% of the time when you run into somebody that's going to maybe show their ass. But yes, I do have a story.
What's the technical term in
It's
Vistage?
a very very technical term. Yes. No, I do have a story about that. Being also a young female officer, comes with a certain amount of challenge because you're expected to lead right out the gate as a brand new second lieutenant, which is intimidating on its best day. And when I was about 22 years old, I looked about 16 years old, and was only made it harder. So I remember one day I was in full dress uniform. I actually was coordinating a huge training exercise at a local base, and I was in there to coordinate this on behalf of my colonel. I walked into someone's office, and an NCO said, "Oh no." He took one look at me and he said, "Whose general secretary are you?" Which, now is funny. At that moment, not so funny. Because it was, so insulting on so many levels. Number one, absolutely insulting that maybe they actually think that that's the way that generals run their staff. Insulting to me. And I did have to. It was the only time I ever really pulled rank and told somebody to get up out of the chair and to stand at attention and to talk to me. And I dressed him down pretty good for that behavior. And then we got over it, and we went on, and that's life.
I'm curious about something because sometimes what happens is like, when you metaphorically punch someone like that in the nose, they tend to have more respect for you afterwards. It's not just the discipline or the threat of punishment. It's actually like they're looking for that type of exchange. They kind of respect that the person can fire back.
I have definitely found that to be true both in that situation as well as the boardroom and many others.
Mm.
But I do think that it's the way that you do it. I mean, because I still knew that I was coming from a position of legitimate authority in that moment, which really helped. Because in the military, it's literally on your uniform.
Mhm.
It's very prescribed. In other places, you have to sort of hold your executive presence in a more subtle way, if that's not readily apparent. But because I approached, I said, "All right, Sergeant, get up." But I was still holding that with a certain amount of confidence. If I had gotten emotional, if I had started shrieking, if I had somehow lost myself in any way at that moment, it would not have been respected. So
Yeah.
I do think it's fine to get it's fine to get emotional. It's fine to get passionate about something. But I do think that there's a way to do that, or there's a way to know that he could have absolutely thrown somebody off their game at that point, and nobody's going to respect that.
Mhm. Yeah. I think it's kind of a test too of like, what's the person's going to be like when the bullets are flying and all that type of stuff. So you got to rise to the occasion. I think there's even something in that where there's a way that you can actually turn yourself into vapor, where it's like, recognizing that the person's not necessarily yelling at you. They're yelling at the father that abandoned them, or and you're the authority figure, that type of thing.
Yes.
So, that's only happened to me twice in my life, but when I was able to do it, it was almost like the Matrix. This man was ex-military, but only a corporal at that never really led, was struggling with his leadership and was dressing me down, and I was, in this, volunteer organization. I was his superior by, like, I don't know, 7, 8, categories of rank,
Mhm.
and he was screaming at me for about 40 straight minutes.
Mhm.
But I tell you, Dondi, it was the most powerful I've ever been. I was literally vapor. All the arrows he was flying at me were going right through me. None of them stuck, which was not the old me. The old me, I would have kneecapped him. What it was just like the Matrix too, because I could kind of catch the arrow in the air and go, he's got a point with this, and then kind of put it in my back pocket, right, and then sit back and go. But I noticed when I was raising my voice a little bit, even saying anything because he was contradicting himself because he was out of control. The he would raise his voice higher. And then I'd sit back and say, okay, he's not really talking to me. He's talking to whatever's going on for him. And I just let it roll and roll and roll and roll and roll. And the other leaders that were in the room were amazed because they sat back and they were like, man, who are you? A week ago, you would have tore this guy apart. And I said, well, he wasn't really talking to me. He was talking to the father that abandoned him. I just happened to be the authority figure in the room. And I'm telling you, it was the most powerful I've ever been. It's like, how do we take in the information, but not have it negatively affect us? You know what I mean? That to me is like true power. Right. But the deal is you got so much background stuff that could help my audience is that what I want to do is talk a little bit about when you were thinking about buying that company, that is a balls out move. So how big was it at the time? What were you concerned about? What did you end up on the other side of it where it was like, oh no, I didn't have to worry about this. I should have been worried about that. Like, what are the lessons involved in that?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. It's incredibly scary. Because even if you want to be the master of your own destiny, and I think a lot of people that are attracted to entrepreneurialism, it comes from a fierce sense of independence. So it's
Mm.
exactly what you want, but because that's what you want so much, that's exactly why it scares you to your core. And in some cases, depending on how you're paying for it, you might be putting up personal assets, you might be putting up, personal things. So it becomes personal real fast. And I think that's kind of the difference between big corporate America and small business is in small business, everything is much more personal and much more immediate because it has to be. And it truly is your ship.
Yeah.
So in my case, I felt very supported initially because I did have some referrals from people that had just made a similar leap, which is why I think discussions like this are so important, why community is so important, because I spoke to 4 or 5 other people that had done a similar thing, and actually who also were veteran business owners, which so I was not only benefiting from what I was about to find out, which I'll be happy to tell you, but also what they had just found out, because many of us were 1 year in, or so some of us were also benefiting from the experience of the others. So I would say, number one, if you can get those outside perspectives, or at least know that you're making the right leap with the right team, because I think that who your broker is or how you found the deal is first and foremost, very important. The deal itself, it was an engineering design firm that was worth about 1.5 to 1.8 at the time, which isn't huge, but it's
But
very niche.
it's huge for you at that time.
Yes,
You know?
exactly,
And,
and yet
and
it felt
here's
huge.
the thing too, like this is the one, like let's call it the one downside, but it's really an upside of Vistage. It's like once you start swimming in that circle, like one of the things I like to say is if you want to be a better tennis player, you have to play tennis with better tennis players beyond a certain level of skill. And then like I remember sitting down in my first Vistage meeting and like one guy just sold his company for $168 million. Another one was like, every one of them in the room was like their resumes trounced mine. I felt like such a slub. I'm sitting back going like, yeah, I'm running this little rinky dink thing. My resume is nothing compared to these dudes. And it was like the downside is doing something balls out where you're taking a major risk, and then you see other people who have taken bigger risks and you feel like that's nothing, but it was something. And for like, and I like to use Noah as an example here because he's in his early 20s, wants to be an entrepreneur down the road, and is considering, does he build it or does he buy it? Or maybe both. Who knows? Maybe be a serial entrepreneur, that type of thing. It's a balls out move. So you have to go into it open-eyed. Surround yourself with people who care about you, and make sure that they're helping you point the energies in the right direction. But it also has to be congruent with who you are. Like you have to understand why you get out of bed in the morning. And then is this the vessel that's going to help you realize why you get out of bed in the morning? Like it's not in and of itself success. It's the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. So is it congruent with that idea? That to me would be number one. It's just my opinion. So when you got into the weeds on it, were the things that you were concerned about, was that the things that you ultimately were concerned about, or was it something that you hadn't even anticipated?
In some ways, it was exactly what I anticipated, because I think that due diligence was fair, and I also had a good seller who was talking straight up to me. about what was going on. So I didn't have any too many nasty surprises on that front.
You already had surprises, man.
Yeah, well, there's always nasty surprises. There was gonna be ugly little rocks as you walk down the path and you uncover one and you're like, okay, that's ugly. That's a lot more ugly than I thought it was. And part of it is, I think, too, is that maybe the previous team or everybody that looked at it didn't think that was going to be a problem. But when you bring new eyes to it or you have new goals, then suddenly something becomes a problem. And in my case, I immediately said, wait a second, all of the external factors of what was happening with the economy at that time. I mean, this was right after the first wave of COVID, and we thought that it was going to be in our rearview mirror. That was not the case. And one of the things that I didn't have a chance to get ahead of was the fact that the Ukraine war and a whole bunch of other things were going on with the supply chain at that time completely disrupted all of my assumptions around cash turn and around project timelines. So I had to adjust, and I immediately felt like I was on my back foot. Not because I hadn't been told what was typical, but because the typical answer now did not match the new normal. So because cash is king, a lot of those early assumptions were no longer relevant, and so I did find myself in a scramble. In the first year, trying to figure out how to navigate through that and grow and scale my way out of some of that at the same time. So, I felt like got anchors pulling you down. And then you also then feel like, okay, well, the best way out of this is to not sit still. We've got to do, proactive things going forward. So I originally thought that I was going to buy that and I was going to be an owner operator for 10 years. But I think that, some of my natural personality traits, as well as a lot of my experiences, immediately had me thinking after the first year. And I felt like I knew what was going on, that I really wanted to do a transformation play and figure out how to scale it for the future. So yeah, it completely, what I set out to do is not where I ended up, but I'm very happy where it ended up. You never know
Well,
until you walk forward.
a good metaphor that I've heard in the past is it's like flying a plane while you're building it. So, like mine was when I first got started with Vistage about 16 years ago. I would reach out to CEOs, and this was specifically for Long Island. Now it's nationwide, but the deal is that back then it was just Long Island, and I would send them a note saying owning a business on Long Island is like having a bad girlfriend or a bad boyfriend. So if I was talking to a woman, I'd say bad boyfriend. If I was talking to a man, I'd say bad girlfriend. It treats you great in the good days. What's it treat you like in the bad days? And I would just put a little question mark next to it and say, if you're ready for a conversation, feel free to reach out to me. And then they call and they're like, what's this about? I'm like, exactly what I just said. And as soon as I'd say bad girlfriend or bad boyfriend to them, they'd go, man, you're so nice. So there's a thing about ending isolation in all of that I think is important too. So that this way you're not just doing it on your own. You're surrounding yourself with other like-minded people who are not competitors. So trade associations don't come into play in this, and they're useful for certain degrees, but there are ways to surround yourself with other like-minded entrepreneurs who are struggling with the same challenges. So picture when I started, originally I had a radio show. It was called Money Talks. My brother and I did it. And the compliance industry for financial advice was so onerous at one point. They wanted us to script the entire interview show. I'm like, we can't do that. I said, okay, so let's pivot. Let's go into interviewing CEOs. So I said, so I started doing that. And what I noticed was as soon as I turned off the on-air light, as soon as the off-air light came on, they'd start crying on my shoulder about some issue that they were up against. And when this shoulder got soggy, they'd switch to this shoulder. And I said, I started noticing that, I don't know if you figure this out about me, but I'm an analytical guy, right? So I started noticing they all fell into the same 8 categories. And they had like at least 2 of the 8 category challenges.
Yeah.
So I said, you know what? I think maybe what we could do is set up an accountability circle where we get together. In this case, it was once a quarter. And then what we do is create battle strategies for whatever we were up against and then hold each other accountable to manifesting that strategy because life gets in the way. And then Vistage came calling saying that, you're reinventing the wheel because I talk about it on the air as fodder for the show. And then they said, why don't you come on board with us? But it all comes back to how do you take that step, that leap, and recognize you're not the only one doing it. Because, I don't know if you noticed this about me too. I'm odd. I'm not a normal person. And I've known that my entire life. I always felt odd. Can you relate to that?
Oh my gosh, in spades. Oh
So,
yes.
in
Total
fact,
oddball.
like one of the things is when I am talking to someone who is like, let's say, an ethnic minority, it's like, this is going to sound weird, but I understand what it's like as best you possibly can, because on some level, we're all minorities. Like you're the only you, I'm the only me, but I know I'm not normal, right? And I don't even mean that necessarily in a good way. The first time I ever felt normal was in my very first Vistage meeting. I looked around the room and I was like, oh, these people are circus freaks just like me.
Yeah.
These people are abnormal.
Yeah.
Like, and that manifests its way in a good way in some ways, but not in others. So how do you minimize the other and maximize the first? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to jump to the other platform. Please join us over at the Middle Market Forum.